Joshomadin, bienvenidos. Welcome. I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey. A journey into the wild electronic frontier of Texas in the year 1990 when the law came gunning for a game. In all honesty, I'm making this video for a few friends of mine who will be interested in this particular topic. At least I hope they'll be interested in it. If anyone else finds this video entertaining or interesting, hey, that's cool too. The topic in question is the time that Steve Jackson Games was raided by the Secret Service. Now, I'm pretty sure most of my friends are familiar with Steve Jackson Games, but for anyone who's not, it's a company based in Austin, Texas, owned and managed by Steve Jackson. How about that? It's not the biggest or wealthiest game company out there, but it has attracted many loyal fans with clever and creative games, many of which are quite humorous, such as Munchkin, that delightful dungeon crawler in which you fight the monsters, grab the loot, and stab your friends in the back. And Illuminati, that fast-paced friendly card game of ruthless global domination. Fnord. You see, in the world of gaming, it pays to have a twisted sense of humor. That doesn't help so much when the law comes calling, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started at AT&T. A computer intruder gained unauthorized access to an AT&T mainframe and downloaded a copy of a text file about the 911 system and the AT&T company's involvement in it. When AT&T found out about this and alerted the Secret Service, well, they all freaked. Computer criminals have been known to mess with the 911 system, and the idea of insider knowledge about the system getting out into the hacker underground sent shivers down many a spine in law enforcement. Unfortunately, by the time the Secret Service had been alerted to the situation, it was kind of too late. Granted, the internet was a good deal smaller and slower back then. Certainly, people didn't have convenient handheld devices that could connect to the internet at any shopping mall or fast food joint. Back then, most people didn't have a personal computer, let alone a modem. And on top of that, internet service was not charged separately from phone service. If you were communicating with a computer outside your state, you'd have to pay long distance rates. That could get very expensive. So things didn't exactly go viral back then the way they do now. Still, by the time Secret Service was aware of the issue, there were many thousands of copies of this document on computers all across the country. There was no way the Secret Service would be able to confiscate every copy. So they figured the next best thing would be to arrest some of the biggest names in the hacker underground and, make examples of them. Well, one particularly big name was the Mentor. The Mentor didn't engage in any computer intrusion himself, but he maintained contact with many figures in the hacker underground and even hosted a bulletin board system as a hangout for a lot of big underground hackers. Now, any youngins watching this might consider a bulletin board system, or BBS, to be a sort of early version of an internet discussion board. But it could be so much more. Many bulletin board systems offered online data storage, file sharing, and email. So many of the services of the internet were wrapped up in these BBSs. Anyway, in addition to hosting his own hacker hangout, the Mentor was a prolific writer. In fact, you might have encountered some of his writing without knowing it. In the movie Hackers, appropriately enough, there's a scene where two Secret Service agents are on stakeout in a car, one of them is reading from something, and he goes, I am a hacker, and this is my manifesto. Huh? Right? Manifesto. You can stop me, but you can't stop us all. And his partner says, now that's cool. What'd you say? Cool? Yeah, cool. That's not cool. It's a fun movie, really. You should watch it. But anyway, that manifesto wasn't written for the movie. It had been written years earlier by the mentor, a man who was steeped in America's actual hacker underground. The mentor also had a day job. Can you guess where? That's right, Steve Jackson Games. After the Secret Service raided the mentor's home and confiscated his computer, they set their sights on his employer. They didn't like what they saw. Steve Jackson Games was an early adopter of the internet. The company maintained a bulletin board system of its own called Illuminati. Steve Jackson Games used the Illuminati board to announce game releases and convention appearances, offer previews of upcoming games, and provide a place for fans to hang out and talk about their favorite games. Like I said, in the world of gaming, it pays to have a twisted sense of humor, but the Secret Service didn't get the joke. For instance, in addition to Illuminati, Steve Jackson put out Car Wars. This was a sort of Mad Max death race game in which players drove souped-up automobiles bristling with weapons and, tried to blow each other up. So the chat on the Illuminati board was filled with talk about various conspiracies and, say, the effects of napalm on rubber tires. Granted, they were talking about games. Games played on paper. Illuminati is a card game with a very tongue-in-cheek approach to its subject. The death-dealing hot rods in Car Wars are really little cardboard figurines being pushed around on graph paper. And it seems so funny now because they're considering the kind of games you can get nowadays, but to the uptight Secret Service agents back then, it looked like terrorists planning a bombing or something. It also didn't help that some of the regulars on the Illuminati board were known computer criminals. Personally, I don't find it very surprising, and I don't think most of my friends would find it very surprising that hackers of all stripes are also gamers. Nerds gonna nerd. And these guys, when talking on the Illuminati board, kept the conversation to their gaming activities, not their computer crimes. Their presence was suspicious enough for the Secret Service. And then there was cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction dealing mainly with the effects of advancing computer technology on society. If you're a fan of Japanese comic books and animation, you might be familiar with such entries as Bubblegum Crisis and Ghost in the Shell. Here in the States, one of the most prominent literary examples would be the author William Gibson, whose works include Neuromancer, Idoru, and Johnny Mnemonic. Yes, that would be the same Johnny Mnemonic that got adapted into a movie starring Keanu Reeves. Yes, that would be the same Keanu Reeves that later starred in The Matrix. As a matter of fact, when I first saw commercials for The Matrix, I thought it was a sequel to Johnny Mnemonic. And, maybe it's because of Keanu's iconic association with cyberpunk cinema that he's been tapped to star in an upcoming cyberpunk video game. Of course, we all know it's Keanu's world and we just live in it. Anyway, back in 1990, the cyberpunk genre was rapidly growing in popularity, and there were a couple games on the market, but Steve Jackson felt there was plenty of room for more. So the company began development on GURPS Cyberpunk. Now, GURPS is an acronym for generic, universal role-playing system. As the name implies, it's a general rule set for role-playing games that ideally players can easily adapt to any genre or setting of their choosing. Of course, Steve Jackson Games puts out its own adaptations and variations of GURPS, some based on genres and some based on specific licensed franchises like Riverworld, Star Trek, and Conan the Barbarian. Anyway, when the company began development on a cyberpunk edition of GURPS, the mentor jumped at the chance to work on his game. After all, any cyberpunk game would have to feature a lot of computer activity, for good or ill. And the mentor figured, with his long experience talking to hackers of all stripes, he could design a game that actual hackers could play without laughing themselves to death. Of course, there's a limit to just how realistic such a game can be. It's played on paper with pencils and dice, and it features technology that didn't exist at the time and might never exist, like the ability to directly control a computer with your brain. But apparently it was all too realistic for the Secret Service, and we'll get back to that. Of course, the Secret Service likely believed that the mentor had a copy of this purloined 911 document on his computer at work, and perhaps they thought they could find extra evidence to slam him with. So, on the morning of March 1st, 1990, the Secret Service raided the offices of Steve Jackson Games. You have to understand, this was unprecedented. The Secret Service, with help from SWAT teams all over the country, had raided plenty of homes. But raiding a business was pretty unprecedented. Still, they were pretty confident. They had made several high-profile arrests and apparently didn't think there was much reason to slow down now. The mentor gave the Secret Service his keys to the building because, he didn't want them breaking down the front door, but they still caused some property damage. They broke open a few boxes in the warehouse. They took bolt cutters to a few padlocks. They even bent a couple letter openers trying to pick the locks on a filing cabinet. And apparently, some of them gobbled up a bunch of jelly beans that one employee had been keeping in a plastic bag, and someone ripped a Dukakis for President sticker in one employee's cubicle. Real professional, guys. Of course, they made off with a lot of computer equipment, including many, many discs. Man, kids, let me tell you about discs one of these days. You have no idea how spoiled you are when it comes to computer data storage. Anyway, they also made off with the mentor's work computer and the computer that hosted the Illuminati board. Naturally, Steve Jackson was furious. The next day, with a lawyer at his side, he marched into the local office of the Secret Service, demanding answers and the return of his money. His property. Well, he didn't get his property. The Secret Service only allowed him to copy off a few vital documents. And the answer he got completely floored him. The Secret Service didn't tell him about the intrusion into the AT&T mainframe. They didn't tell him about a possible threat to the 911 system. They accused him and his company of writing a manual for computer crime. Yes. They accused Steve Jackson Games of writing GURPS Cyberpunk to teach people how to actually intrude into real computers and commit credit card fraud, stuff like that. Steve Jackson told them it's science fiction. But they said multiple times, apparently, no, this is real. They even sealed the warrant, which is typically done when the authorities believe someone's life is in immediate danger. What, like they thought Steve Jackson was a a mob boss who would hire a hitman to assassinate the mentor before he could testify. Yet somehow they had no problem making Steve Jackson and the rest of the country think that they had raided his business to prevent the publication of a book. They apparently didn't think they'd get any kind of blowback on the free speech front. I don't know. There was some strange thinking going on in the agents in charge of this whole crusade. It was a curious combination of reckless overconfidence and ridiculous paranoia. Anyway, a few months later, the Secret Service returned some of Steve Jackson's property, but they still kept a lot of it, including all the files pertaining to GURP Cyberpunk. It wouldn't be until 3 years later, in 1993, that Steve Jackson finally faced off against the Secret Service in court. And their arguments were something else. The Secret Service essentially argued that they didn't know what they were doing. They argued that at the time of the raid, they didn't realize Steve Jackson Games was, a publisher of entertainment media like books, the kind that are protected by the First Amendment. They also argued that they didn't really confiscate a book. They confiscated computer equipment that happened to have drafts of a book on it. And that was really just an irrelevant coincidence. Well, the judge didn't find their arguments very compelling. The judge berated the Secret Service and told them they could have avoided all this hassle if they had simply returned Steve Jackson's property. All they had to do was copy the data they were interested in and returned all the physical equipment to Steve Jackson Games. Apparently, no one at the Secret Service thought to do this. Again, some funny thinking going on. The judge awarded Steve Jackson and his company $50,000 in damages, plus over $250,000 in attorney's fees. Now, that might sound like a great victory for Steve Jackson, but the money really wasn't enough to fully recoup his company's losses. In fact, he had to fire half his employees, and it was years before the company truly recovered. Now, before I finish this little video, I think I should talk a little bit about that 911 document, the one that had touched off this whole crackdown. Before Steve Jackson had his day in court, there was a trial for the hacker who had illicitly copied this document and his associates who had helped him spread throughout the internet. In the course of that trial, it was revealed that this document, which had caused so much consternation at AT&T and the Secret Service, which supposedly posed such a threat to national security and set off a whole nationwide crusade, was a complete non-issue. Yeah. AT&T had a catalog of documents you could order from the company. Yes, that was the real kicker. This stuff was publicly available. Including information about their participation in the 911 system, including far more information than was contained in that particular document. This was not well known beyond, telecommunications engineers and hardcore phone fans. But if you wanted this information, all you had to do was call AT&T and buy it. Now, that might sound like a great victory for this hacker and his associates, but in that case, the Secret Service barely got a slap on the wrist. And that hacker and his associates still ended up doing time for theft and the transfer of stolen property. Of course, that was a long time ago. As of this recording, it has been 30 years since the raid on Steve Jackson Games. 29 years since the trial of that hacker and his associates, and 27 years since Steve Jackson faced off against the Secret Service. All those hacker boys are out of prison now. In fact, one of them went on to become a lawyer. And Steve Jackson is doing pretty well for himself these days. His company is still winning the hearts of fans with games like the aforementioned Illuminati and Munchkin and Zombie Dice. As a matter of fact, there's an episode of Tabletop in which Will Wheaton plays Munchkin with stars of the Guild, Felicia Day and Cindy Parikh, and Steve Jackson himself. At the end of that episode, Steve Jackson tells Will, "I have no more enemies." So Steve Jackson certainly seems to think that he's come out ahead, all things considered. If you'd like to know more, I'll leave you a couple links. You can read Steve Jackson's own account of these events on his company's website. There's also a great book by Bruce Sterling called The Hacker Crackdown. It is a fascinating look into computer crime and law in the late 80s and early 90s. The book is what Sterling calls literary freeware. This means the author is offering the full text of the book on the internet for free. So, read it. I highly recommend you do. It is a wild ride. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you're expecting another video like this, I honestly don't know what to tell you. Like I said, I made this video because I have a few friends who might find this topic relevant to their interests. I don't know when or what my next video will be, but I doubt I'll be making one quite like this anytime soon. Anyway, I again thank you for watching, and I urge you to be careful out there as you wander the electronic frontier. Khodafez, adios, and goodbye.